Welcome to episode 11 of Inspiring Naturalism. I'm Connie Barlow.
And I'm Michael Dowd.
And the title of today's program is The Magic of Reality.
And we're here to talk about Richard Dawkins' new book, The Magic of Reality.
Subtitle:
How We Know What's Really True.
And we're excited about introducing you to this book today because we see it has really broad implications for society along the lines that we've been promoting for 10 years.
As they say in journalism, don't bury the lead. So here's the lead. Buy this book and don't be selfish and just buy one copy for yourself. Everybody that you would buy a Christmas gift or a holiday gift between now and the end of the year, buy it. Buy it for them because you will love it, they will love it, guaranteed.
And we're going to give you an introduction to some of the things you'll find on the inside. Part of the reason we're doing this as a video instead of one of our usual audio podcasts is that this book is richly illustrated.
Yeah, Dave McKean is the illustrator for this, and throughout the book, the illustrations are phenomenal. They just bring to life Richard's words, and Richard really writes for a young audience, but really any age. Anybody who's 10 years old and older will love this book, both the words and the illustrations.
And I've got to say, I've been a science writer for, 20 years now, and writing in evolutionary biology, and I learned some new things in this book. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things that the illustrator in particular was able to do in working with Richard Dawkins' words to give me a shift in better having a feeling understanding of what this real world is about.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing that I want to say during this introduction to this book is that I think more suffering in the world results from people who are out of touch with reality. It's almost like we're in the midst of a collective insanity, where normally when you think of the word insane, it's the inability to distinguish the inner interpretive world from the outer real world, the measurable world, the objective reality and subjective reality. And when you can't distinguish those two, you become a danger to yourself and others. That's the definition of insanity. And there are billions of people in the world today who can't distinguish that because in part they've never had the outer world, the objective reality, shown to them with the kind of majesty and magic and soul-nourishing, heart-touching, inspirational quality that the ancient myths have had and that the religious traditions offer. And so what Richard's done is provided a way of addressing many of the core questions that kids and adults have always asked, and then provides a multiplicity of mythic ways that traditional cultures have answered those that clearly are inspiring, clearly touch some deep part of us, and then compares that to how we really know this now and how we've come to know this, both the evidence and what we in fact know through science. But he does it in a way that helps us really experience the magic of reality.
Now, not surprisingly, Richard is taking some heat for this book. It's very bold. It's necessary in what we're doing. And as we introduce it to you, you're going to see why. So we're going to begin by giving you an introduction to the titles of the chapters here in the table of contents. We'll also then give you a couple paragraphs that we're going to recite for you that give the crucial foreground for what this book is really doing. So Michael, let's read the titles.
What is reality? What is magic?
Chapter 2, who was the first person?
Chapter 3, why are there so many different kinds of animals?
Chapter 4, what are things made of?
Chapter 5, why do we have night and day, winter and summer?
Chapter 6, what is the sun?
Chapter 7, what is the rainbow?
Chapter 8, when and how did everything begin?
Chapter 9, are we alone?
Chapter 10, what is an earthquake?
Chapter 11, why do bad things happen?
And finally, Chapter 12, what is a miracle? So we're going to begin by reading from Chapter 1, what is reality, what is magic, and specifically starting at this subsection titled Science and the Supernatural, Explanation and its Enemy. Michael and I are going to alternate reading the first 5 paragraphs or so.
Each chapter of this book is going to be about one particular aspect of reality. The sun, for instance, or earthquakes, or rainbows, or the many different kinds of animals. I want to now turn to the other key word of my title, magic. Magic is a slippery word. It is commonly used in three different ways, and the first thing I must do is distinguish between them. I'll call the first one supernatural magic, the second one stage magic, and the third one, which is my favorite meaning and the one I intend in my title, poetic magic.
Supernatural magic is the kind of magic we find in myths and fairy tales. In miracles, too, though I shall leave those to one side for now and return to them in the final chapter. It's the magic of Aladdin's lamp, of Wizard's spell, of the Brothers Grimm, of Hans Christian Andersen, and of J.K. Rowling. It's the fictional magic of a witch casting a spell and turning a prince into a frog, or a fairy godmother changing a pumpkin into a gleaming coach. These are the stories we all remember with fondness from our childhood, and many of us still enjoy when served up in a traditional Christmas pantomime. But we all know this kind of magic is just fiction and does not happen in reality.
Stage magic, by contrast, really does happen, and it can be great fun. Or at least something really happens, though it isn't what the audience thinks it is. A man on a stage, usually it's a man for some reason, so I shall say he, but you can insert she if you prefer, deceives us into thinking that something astonishing, it may even seem supernatural, has happened when what really has happened was something quite different.
The third meaning of magic is the one I mean in my title, poetic magic. We are moved to tears by a beautiful piece of music, and we describe the performance as magical. We gaze up at the stars on a dark night with no moon and no city lights, and, breathless with joy, we say the sight is pure magic. We might use the same word to describe a gorgeous sunset, or an alpine landscape, or a rainbow against a dark sky.
In this sense, magical simply means deeply moving, exhilarating, something that gives us goosebumps, something that makes us feel more fully alive. What I hope to show you in this book is that reality, the facts of the real world as understood through the methods of science, are magical in this third sense, the poetic sense, the good to be alive sense.
Now I want to return to the idea of the supernatural and explain why it can never offer us a true explanation of the things we see in the world and the universe around us. Indeed, to claim a supernatural explanation of something is not to explain it at all, and, even worse, to rule out any possibility of its ever being explained. Why do I say that?
Because anything supernatural, quote unquote, must by definition be beyond the reach of a natural explanation. It must be beyond the reach of science and the well-established, tried and tested scientific method that has been responsible for the huge advances in knowledge we have enjoyed over the last 400 years or so. To say that something happens supernaturally is not just to say we don't understand it, but to say we will never understand it, so don't even try.
Science takes exactly the opposite approach. Science thrives on its inability, so far, to explain everything, and uses that as the spur to go on asking questions, creating possible models and testing them, so that we make our way, inch by inch, closer to the truth. If something were to happen that went against our current understanding of reality, scientists would see that as a challenge to our present model, requiring us to abandon or at least change it. It is through such adjustments and subsequent testing that we approach closer and closer to what is true.
That's precisely why Connie and I like to call this epic of evolution the story of the changing story.
Indeed. Just with that little reading, I think you can get a sense of why it is that Richard Dawkins is treading onto dangerous territory. And that is, he can't present a full picture to children and youth and adults about why science is important and why is it important to distinguish mythic stories from other eras, pre-scientific eras, from the best evidence we have available today. Yes, indeed, he is treading on the toes of any religious tradition that considers ancient scriptures more important than modern evidence.
And it's not just more important. I mean, the two questions that humans have always needed to answer in every culture is what's real and what's important. Or as philosopher of religion Loyal Roos speaks about it, how things are and which things matter. And the fact is that there are billions of human beings today that are operating with a GPS that's so wildly an inner guidance system that's so wildly out of date with respect to our best understanding of what's real and what's important, or how things are and which things matter. And what Richard provides is a way of valuing science, the scientific method, and the entire scientific worldwide endeavor as providing our best map of what's real and what's important, so that we can move together into a healthy future.
And what's so exciting about this book is that Richard Dawkins is one of the world's greatest scientists. His first book, 1976, The Selfish Gene, really established him in evolutionary biology. His 1986 book, Blind Watchmaker, is what inspired me to become a science writer. And then his 2004 book, Ancestor's Tale, I consider to be his first contribution to children, though he doesn't know it. And that's because I created an interactive children's story that I call River of Life, based on the information of ancestors and the trajectory of evolution that he gave us in that book. It's fabulous. But here, Richard is making his first intentional contribution to children. And part of the reason that I no longer write science for adults very much is because many of us have been trying for decades to bring this evolutionary understanding far enough into our society that it's no longer intruding on public schools, that it's no longer preventing children from getting an understanding of reality and the excitement of it, owing to religious intransigence on moving into a modern world. So what I've been emphasizing is really bringing this understanding to children, and in provocative, mythic, exciting, participatory ways. And surprisingly enough, for many of you watching this video, I find the best place to do that is through liberal religious education, where we can teach values, where we can move into storytelling, and where there won't be anyone in a public context protesting that we're intruding on families' right to teach their kids origin stories that they view to be correct. Chapter 2 of Richard's book is called Who is the First Person? And here's the best way for us to show you in a very short time how it is that Richard brings myths from around the world into a context to help us understand and have an appreciation for the attempts people have always made for trying to explain and to explain to children the basic questions that children always ask. Now, the controversial part is that after telling several myths from cultures that really no longer exist, Richard talks about a myth that many still hold dear and true.
The Hebrew tribes of the Middle East had only a single god, who they regarded as superior to the gods of rival tribes. He had various names, none of which they were allowed to say. He made the first man out of dust and called him Adam, which just means man. He deliberately made Adam like himself. Indeed, most of the gods of history were portrayed as men, or sometimes women, often of giant size and always with supernatural powers.
Now just consider, had you been raised with a book like this as a child, in which you were taught science, you were taught myths of the world, and you were taught about the Judeo-Christian stories in the same context, what would that have meant to you?
So, skipping a few paragraphs, Richard says, "Stories are fun, and we all love repeating them. But when we hear a colorful story, whether it's an ancient myth or a modern urban legend whizzing around the internet, it's also worth stopping to ask whether it, or any part of it, is true. So let's ask ourselves that question. Who was the first person? And take a look at the true scientific answer."
And so the rest of chapter 2 is an exposition of what is the reality, and seeing it in a way that you go, wow, this is real. This is our best evidence gathered from scientists all through the world, and yet it's awesome. It's magical.
And it doesn't this is the thing, it doesn't diss the religious traditions. It just helps them see that you can have inspiring fictional stories and hold them as inspiring fictional stories, and don't confuse them with our best evidential understanding of reality.
Now, as I mentioned at the outset, this book is also extraordinary for the illustrations. Here's one of the first things you're going to see, and I'm not going to tell you what it means, but it appears for a number of pages throughout. And taking a close-up of it, you see that what we have here is a stack of cards. Now, my personal favorite illustration comes in chapter 5, the title of which is, Why Do We Have Night and Day, Winter and Summer? And it's here that Richard moves beyond biology, and he talks about orbits. I mean, this is something that kids all try to understand. And the reason I love this image of a cannon sitting on top of Earth, shooting a cannonball around at different velocities, making it further and further and further around the Earth as the cannonball shoots out faster and faster and faster, is that it gave me an entirely new image where I feel orbits in a different way. I think I picked up my image of a bucket filled with water, where that if you swing it fast enough, you can swing it actually over your head and around, and the water won't fall out. I think I got that in 3rd grade. And so that I've been carrying that image around. I've imprinted on that image as my understanding of planets in orbits and moon in orbits and the Hubble telescope in orbit. That's what I think of. But now with this image and with Richard's words explaining how orbits work, how it's possible to keep something orbiting around Earth, or any large object for that matter, it's really this image of the cannon that speaks to me now, and I'm grateful for that. Now, the important thing to recognize is that Richard isn't trying to do everything in this book. First of all, he's not written this book for small children. The way I see it, it's starting around 5th grade that a child will actually be able to read this book themselves. Prior to that, it can be actually a bedtime story in very small doses that a parent can read to their child. It's very important for us to realize that whatever goes on in school, children in the past have never demanded to understand absolutely everything they hear in order to find something fascinating and be engaged in it. In fact, one of the things and beauties I see of this book is that it's a real opportunity to read some of it to young children at an age before they can fully understand, and then to read it again a year later, and then again. And then by the time they're in 5th grade or 6th grade, they can read it themselves, and they'll have an aha experience of, oh, you mean that's how it works, or oh, I now see that picture. This is the way humans have always learned. Now, another thing that Richard doesn't do in this book, in addition to not making it for very young children, is that Richard doesn't make any attempt to take our best scientific evidence and do what people have always done. The best understanding of reality that people have had in any part of the world at any time, they fashion that into mythic stories, often that have values embedded with them in order to answer the children's questions. So Richard doesn't do that, but it doesn't mean that we can't do that. And in fact, many of us already have been doing that. So I would suggest for parents, teachers, religious educators, anyone who wants to get their children on this path of valuing reality, but not having it sour for them, not having this huge distinction between science is fact and boring, and, Harry Potter is cool and interesting. No, science can also be just as exciting as Harry Potter. What I would suggest are the children's books produced by Jennifer Morgan. It's a trilogy, Born with the Bang. And we have used this in many contexts. We have gotten extraordinary responses from parents of children as young as 3 or 4 actually having them read to them. Beautiful illustrations by Dana Lynn Anderson. So in addition to the magic of reality, pick up Jennifer Morgan's Born with a Bang trilogy for your younger children. As well, I suggest you take a look at the parables on our website, thegreatstory.org, or just Google the words evolution and parables, and I'll take you right there. What we started doing about 10 years ago was taking themes or episodes within the full 13.7 billion year story of the evolving universe and turning it into narrative scripts that can be acted out or read and that actually have things like stars and seaweed and fishes conversing with one another. Now, we all know that stars and fishes and seaweeds don't converse with one another, but nonetheless, we can have stories in which they do. And when it's time for children to give up Santa Claus, as they all do at some point or another, they'll have no problem shedding the understanding of, gee, you mean the lucky little seaweed never actually talked? No problem. But they'll be able to keep the underlying science, the understanding, in mind.
Just a little background on the Evolutionary Parables. When we first approached a well-known paleontologist, Mark McMiniman, to write an evolutionary parable, he balked at it and he said, I can't do that kind of thing. And then one of our friends, Denny O'Neil, who wrote Batman comics for 25 years, he wrote Superman comics before that. He's one of the legendary people still alive in the comic book industry. Denny said, sure, I'll take a crack at it. And he wrote a parable called Ozzie and the Snortlefish. And it was about how vertebrate life came on land. Well, we sent that to Mark McMiniman, and he read it, and he said, oh, I can do that. So he wrote one that was a real hit called The Lucky Little Seaweed. So I highly recommend these evolutionary parables.
And we know these parables work. They've been performed in a number of Montessori schools, even some public schools, and a heck of a lot of summer camps in church contexts. We'll give you an example of how easy it is to just download these in PDF form off of the website and use them in your own family or group context. Because the only props required are a few scarves, which you can see here on the couch.
So I think the last thing that I'd like to say is what I shared at the beginning, which is I think this is a great gift book for everybody that you know and love, who you'd really love to have a more intimate, personal relationship with reality. And I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes from Carl Sagan. He says, "Science is at least in part informed worship." Science is at least in part informed worship. This book led me there, and I think it'll do it for you too.
In closing, for me, part of what stimulated me to want to present this commentary is not just that I really enjoyed having the magic of reality being bedtime reading for the past week, but I also received just this week an email, not uncommon of the kind of email I often receive. And that is, it came from a woman who has a 10-year-old daughter who homeschools her daughter. And she wrote me this email. She said, "We homeschool, and science in the homeschool community has been a challenge. If a curriculum covers evolution, it is often banned from homeschool conventions. If evolution is covered, it is followed with, quote, proof of creation, and then a 6,000-year timeline of existence to disprove evolution by their standards. I'm living in the dark ages in the homeschooling community, and it's not much better in the local schools here in Georgia."
So thank you, Richard and Dave, for producing an amazing book that we're going to tell everybody about.
This is Connie Barlow.
And Michael Dowd.
There's real poetry in the real world. Science is the poetry of reality.
We can do science, and with it, we can improve our lives.
There's real poetry in the real world. Science is the poetry of reality.
The story of humans is a story of ideas that shine light into dark corners.